A very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on wherever you're joining us from. I welcome you all back to session 5 of day 3 on modernism and postmodernism of the 7-day online international faculty development program on language and literature, a pragmatic approach. I welcome Dr. R. Saravanan, principal and patron of the program, Dr. Shakila Matthew, Dean Academics, Head Department of English and convener of the program, Mr. Logesh Kumar S., Administrative Officer, members of Faculty of English of VET Institute of Arts and Science, and the teaching fraternity of English language and literature from around the world to the session. I am profusely elated to invite our resource person for the day, Dr. Ampat Varghese Koshy, a remarkable literary critic, poet, anthology writer, editor, and an author par excellence. He is presently working as an assistant professor of English in College of Arts and Humanities, Jazan University, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This weaver of words embarked on his journey as a writer at a very young age and won Shankar's International Award for Writing when he was just 7. He was a Pushkar Poetry Prize nominee in 2012 and a 4-time Best Poem winner in Destiny Poets International Community of Poets in 2013, 14, 18, 19, and he was featured thrice in Camel Salon's The Hump for Best Poem and Editor's Pick. He has written, co-written, and co-edited a vast number of books with phenomenal writers such as A.V. Varghese, Gokarnath Gangne, Angel Meredith, Madhumita Ghosh, Zainat Ibrahim, Rukia M.K., and Beena Biswas, just to name a few. In his writing, there is a confluence of poetry and prose, one naturally flowing into the other so often that the differences begin to blur and everything becomes poetic prose and prosaic poetry. He is a reputed critic and expert on Samuel Beckett, having done his PhD on him as well as having written a book on him, Samuel Beckett's English Poetry, besides being a literary theoretician. His commendable literary works, Scream and Other Urban Legends, Fix, Allusions to Simplicity, and Birds of Different Feathers, make him a true ambassador of everything that is literary, artistic, and aesthetic. His works offer staggering insights into the human nature and stands testimony to the writer's sensitivity and the boundless wisdom that he possesses. This luminary's penchant for writing is also evinced in his undertaking the task of writing 15 books currently, including of one on Bob Dylan. A prolific writer, he won a certificate for NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month USA in 2018, and completed NaPoWriMo, National Poetry Writing Month USA in 2019. He recently achieved 10,000 reads on ResearchGate for his research articles. His genre-bending, powerful, unique, and experimental works make him one of the most powerful contemporary voices in Indian writing in English. This is not all. This philanthropist in him has a die-hard attitude. In 2010, he began his lifetime project, an Autism National Program Office, Autism for Help Village, with his wife Anna Gabriel, to bring adequate educational, therapeutic, medical, vocational, and other assistance to the unserved autistic children and their families and caregivers in the communities of South India. He also instituted the Rural International Literary Prize in 2014 for excellence in writing to encourage writers to produce their best work by giving them a beginning to aim higher. Sir, may we now have the pleasure of listening to you?
Thank you so much, Suman. Uh, yeah, thank you. I can see you and I can see myself. Uh, Good morning to everyone. A very good morning to all of you. I hope that all of you can hear me clearly. So if one or two of you can type in the chat that you can hear me clearly, I can go ahead. Thank you very much. So, this seminar is a 7-day seminar, very comprehensive one. And I am, impressed by the word used in the title, which says pragmatic. And I was thinking about that because my approach is more analytical, but it's also pragmatic. But here, the title that I have given for my talk, Modernism and Postmodernism. What I hope to do is to have a relook at these two things, which I hope will help you pragmatically. If you are working in these areas, and even if you are not, you need to know about these two areas as a student of literature, as a student of language, and even as a student of linguistics, which are the areas that we work in. Because you need a foundation, and nowadays you need to be very focused and narrow and an expert in something or the other, but at the same time you also need a broad understanding of many things which you have to keep updating. So let me go into the talk um, about modernism and postmodernism now and try to make it pragmatic. What I've done is basically give an overview, but along the way, I think that it will be something more than an overview and begin to make sense in terms of how you can apply it in your own fields of research or specialization, or in writing your theses or your research papers, or even in creative writing. So let's start. So I want to start by talking about something that Jacques Derrida, uh, whom you all know, who is supposed to be the leading expert, or even you can say the father of deconstruction. What he says about origins. In all myths, there are origin stories. But Derrida says something very interesting. He says that if you start searching for the origin of something, you can't find the origin. You keep going back and you don't reach the origin. The search, uh, when we search for origins, we keep finding them unavailable and leading to detours and dead ends and going ever backwards to where they are lost in the mist of time or are not there at all. As always, before the start, we find something else and we are pulled back in several directions simultaneously. So the search for origin or origins is like following two parallel lines that may meet at infinity, but probably never does. So to talk of the origin of modernism or the origins of modernism is futile. And I'll explain why that is. But since I have to start somewhere, let me start following Derrida, not at the very beginning. Unlike Julie Andrews in The Sound of Music, she has a song and she says, let's start at the very beginning. And then she tells us the notes, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. But then she herself changes and she says, this is not working. Let me try a different approach. And there's a famous song, do, a deer, a female deer. So in the same way, let me start at the beginning and not start at the beginning as a student of literature. Some people, say modernism started in the 19th century, and they place its beginning in France. They even give a date. Some people say it started in 1853. And primarily, they say it started with poets like um, Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Stephen Mallarmé, uh, for his startling poem, A Throw of the Dice. And also people who became famous later in England through T.S. Eliot, like Jules Romains, or through Beckett, like Guillaume Apollinaire and André Breton, and French symbolists like Théophile Gautier. I'll talk about this later. But I am a student of English literature. And so I approached modernism, or I was introduced to modernism through English literature. So for me, the beginning again is in the 19th century. And for me, the beginning is in the time of Victorianism. So there's a critic called George P. Landau, and he has an entire website on the Victorian age, a very good website. And I'm teaching Victorian literature, so I use that website a lot for reference. So in it, there's an introductory essay on Victorianism, where he says that it's not just the Victorian age, it's not just about Victorians, and the Victorian age can be called the parent of the modern. So we need to look at some of the features of modernism in its initial stages, when it was nascent, in its birth pangs, before we go on to modernism proper, which according to some critics begins in the 20th century, after the turn of the century, the fin de siècle. So let's look at some of the features that make it so. And I will be centering my quest for an origin in England, because I come from the field of English literature. So what are the features, or what are the elements of modernism in its beginning stages and throughout? The first thing is, there was an agrarian revolution, meaning the introduction of mechanization to help with agriculture and fishing. There was a scientist called Jethro Tull, and he invented something called the seed drill. And there was a threshing machine, and boats, became instruments of fishing which could have engines, etc. The second one, which you all know, is that this was the time of industrialization or the industrial revolution. So what does that mean? This is connected to Marxist analysis. What it means is, capital mattered. There began to be a new class of rich people, the nouveau riche, and the main thing was the mass manufacture that was made possible in factories due to machines. Production, the tools of production became such that many people could be served, could be made consumers at the same time, by the simple fact that, for example, a pair of shoes that was made by one artisan with his hands could now be produced in thousands and could be distributed through transport everywhere. So the industrial revolution, industrialization, factories, mass manufacture or production, which needed capital, came in as a very big feature of the beginning of modernism. Then there was, attendant to that, the rise of the city. If you study the history of mankind, first men were vagabonds, nomads, gypsies, wandering the face of the earth. Then they settled near rivers for an obvious reason. As the numbers increased, they wanted water. And after that, later they developed cities that were around the temple or the church or the mosque, which was the center, theocentric societies, or the synagogue, or the Gurudwara, etc. After that came modernization, when the city became a place that began to hang around the universities. So a very early form was when you had the city of Oxford and the city of Cambridge. But actual modernization kicked in when the city began to be built around the industries. So now you have Bangalore in India, for example, which is built around the electronic city, whereas earlier it was called the city of gardens. And you have Hyderabad and Secunderabad, which is again called cyber cities. And these things are built around industries, and this is a big difference. Villages were built around agriculture, but these are no longer built around water. They're not built around religion or spirituality. They're not built around education, but they are built around industries. This is really a landmark, the rise of the city, of the urban culture of urbanization. So there was a shift from an agrarian or rural economy to an industrial economy. And along with this came the rise of colonialism and imperialism, the notion of empire, which was driven by, in Britain, Belgium, Spain, France, Portugal, Holland. All these are the colonial countries. We know about the havoc they created in so many parts of the world, and also the new things they brought in, the change they brought in, which cannot be denied, and we can't go back to an earlier age. But how did they do it? England, for example, because of the navy, the power of the navy, steam engines for trains. There was even a train running from Kolkata in India to London and back. And superior weaponry, guns and cannons by which enemies could be killed from a far distance, and transportation, the building of roads, and of course later electricity and things like that. There was a breakdown of formal religion. In this case, in England, Christianity viewed as a battle between faith and doubt, or science and reason, and tradition and irrationality. So, this was spearheaded by people like Martin Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, and Hus, and Bruno in the field of science. So these are points, okay? The first point is the agrarian revolution. The second one is the industrial revolution. The third one is the rise of the city. The fourth one is the shift from agrarian economy to industrial economy. The fifth, the rise of colonialism and imperialism. The sixth, the breakdown of formal religion. The seventh, the move away from monarchy to democracy or communism and socialism. The rise of Marxism. And then eighth, the rise of psychology. So Marx was a key figure, and then Freud was a key figure. And ninth, the pull away from morality to a new aesthetic embodied in the turn of the century poets like Oscar Wilde and Ernest Dowson, and critics like Walter Pater. Then there was a theory of evolution brought in by Charles Darwin, and Darwinism, social Darwinism, etc., with its plus and minus points. And finally, there was a rise of feminism, symbolized in England by the rise of a writer like Virginia Woolf. So we have all these plus points in a way, but along with that, there was also mechanization, dehumanization, universal education, the rise of overcrowding in cities, population explosion, ill health, crime, poverty, gender discrimination, child labor, bad orphanages, depredation of nature, and homelessness as well as joblessness. They were all the other side of the coin. And nowadays people, talk a lot about Anthony Giddens, who is, of course, a great writer. And, he speaks about modernity a lot. But, the critique of modernity already started in the Victorian times in writers like Charles Dickens, which I want you to remember. So let us look at modernism as literature now, after my sketchy introduction. That is not sketchy because I'll relate it later to texts I am speaking about, as it deals with society and manners, economics, politics, religion, philosophy, psychology, art, literature, science and technology, ideologies, and other fields like history. So this is where I make it pragmatic. or it becomes helpful for us when you look at any field. What I feel is you have to look at it in connection with these uh, points, with sociology, with economics, politics, religion, psychology, art, literature, science and technology, ideologies, history, and of course now with digital literacy. Only then do you get a holistic picture of the whole thing. In fiction, modernism does not start, so I am starting, modernism. I have divided it in terms of literature in a very simple way into talking about fiction, talking about drama and poetry. Fiction first, poetry then, because fiction is really modern. And after that, drama, and then finally non-fiction, where I also deal with literary criticism and theory. And I have to be brief because we only have about 1 hour or 1.5 hours, and we also need to, speak about postmodernism. So in fiction, modernism does not start with the Victorian age in English literature. So this is why Derrida says, when we speak about origins, it becomes confusing because there are many origins scattered all over the place, and we keep going back. So when we speak about fiction, for example, which is considered to be the acme or epitome of modernist literature, I have to speak about Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Sterne, that broke with all contemporary notions of the novel as an art form that was only emerging at that time. Why do we say that? Primarily because people in the age of modernism began to lose or let go of their ideas of order and coherence in the matter of form and content to some extent, to find a new form and content which suited the age's yet indescribable characteristics that Ezra Pound called satirically a grimace, brought about by too many rapid historical changes I will deal with now. And in this, when the modernist novels were writing novels that symbolized or were typical examples of modernism, they knew or they didn't know that some of it had already been done powerfully by Lawrence Sterne. And it's very interesting what he did. So I really want to talk about it. And now we come to the crux of the matter, which is analysis. A further example is needed from the book itself. Let us take the moment of Yorick's death in the novel. This is a character called Yorick in Tristram Shandy's, in Lawrence Sterne's Tristram Shandy, and he's dying. He's a young man in the novel, he's dying. The name is taken from Hamlet, which is referential or intertextual, because Hamlet has a clown who never appears in the play, but whose name is Yorick, whose skull he takes, and he thinks this is all life is about. After death, you become just a skull. Now here, in Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Sterne, in book 1, chapter 12, it ends in a very interesting way, Yorick dies. But how does Tristram Shandy, who is supposed to be narrating the story, or how does Lawrence Sterne present his death? And this is what is really interesting. He says, Eugenius was convinced from this that the heart of his friend was broke. He squeezed his hand and then walked softly out of the room, weeping as he walked. Yorick followed Eugenius with his eyes to the door. He then closed them and he never opened them more. Now you see, if you have read the book, I don't know how many of you have read the book. at this point, there's a very interesting image. The image is of a black door. On the page, you can see a black door, which is the last thing. The last thing that Yorick sees is the door, the shape of the door, and then he closes his eyes, so it goes black. This is one of the most significant moments in the history of fiction leading to modernism, because what is being discussed here, it is death. And for the first time in the history of fiction, a writer has managed to create a narrative technique by which we enter the mind of the imaginary character, we enter the body and heart of the imaginary character, and then that character dies, and we also die with him. I mean, this is incredible. We see what he sees when he dies, which is his black door. And what does every artist know about death? Every artist knows that death cannot be spoken of, because none of us have experienced death. And once you die, you can't speak about it. So death can be represented best by silence, by a blank page, or by this black door, a portal into which people go, but we don't know whether there's anything behind the door. And that's why it's black, although it has the shape of a door. So this is so startling. This experiment by Lawrence Stern, Tristram Shandy, was so startling and so different, because it enters the visual media, it goes beyond literature, it tries to penetrate silence, it creates a rupture or discontinuity with language, it goes into the field of design and aesthetics, and it becomes an origin text for modernist fiction. It becomes an origin text for modernist fiction. We see here a clean break with narratology as known till then, as the text here is no longer logocentric, but deviates to the graphic to make sense of death, to find an equivalent to silence and its blankness or nothingness or emptiness, where all existence ceases, even the awareness of existence, and finds it in the shape of a black door. This is followed again by an engraving on a tombstone saying, "Alas, pure Yorick," which might mean that Yorick is to be pitied for being dead, for not having faith in an afterlife, or for being in hell, perhaps, or for dying young. But the point of startling modernity here is the writer creates a manner of narrative. For the first time in reading history, perhaps, the reader enters literally the body of the imaginary character and experiences death as seen from and through his eyes, a level of complexity in content, form, and psychology at the narrative level of form and content, heralding a new aesthetic that, while unexpected, can be called without any doubt modern. So now let's come to modernist fiction. From the startling entry through Lawrence Stern through his novel Tristram Shandy. You know, fiction is supposed to have 5 elements, and those elements are plot and story, and setting, point of view, theme, and characterization. But modernism is an age of revolution where all this was overturned. Let's start with point of view. If you read Henry James's The Ambassadors, you can see that, and his other books, including Turn of a Screw, you know, The Wings of a Dove, Portrait of a Lady, you can see Henry James, what is his contribution to fiction? His contribution is, for the first time, the point of view became of most importance in the novel, and this had not been done before. So you can say that he, in a sense, deconstructed the novel without knowing such a word. But it was not only that, he was foregrounding or highlighting or privileging the point of view. The second writer we all have to speak about is James Joyce. Starting with Dubliners, Giacomo Joyce, his play Exiles, his work on Ibsen, his poetry books. He was a trailblazer, but he broke into the limelight with a very traditional realist novel, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. But then he wrote the landmark book of modernist fiction, which is Ulysses. And then he wrote the landmark book, according to the best critic on postmodernism, which is Finnegan's Wake. Jean-Francois Lyotard says this is the best book of postmodernism. I'll come to that later. But in Ulysses, what does Joyce do? He brings in a new form. He brings in a new structure. So I told you, Henry James, by privileging point of view, made a breakthrough in the novel. And Joyce made another breakthrough. How did he make this breakthrough? By privileging narrative, form, and structure. By bringing in the stream of consciousness. He didn't start it. It started in France. But he is the one who took it to a level where it penetrated all over the world. All of us have been influenced by the stream of consciousness technique when we write novels today, by rebelling against it or going along with it, or being somewhere in between, or trying to be outside, like Julio Cortázar with Hopscotch. But you know, T.S. Eliot said, you know, Joyce's method of writing a novel, where he had a structure and form, where he made parallels with Homer's Odyssey. The journey of Odyssey, each episode there has a parallel in Ulysses with the journey of Raymond Bloom. And you know, it's like a satire or a parody or a pale pastiche, but it's so powerful that that Eliot said this is a method that you can compare with the method of Einstein. Joyce's discovery is as important as the discovery of Einstein in the field of literature, and Eliot himself followed this method in writing The Wasteland. So plot and story take a back seat, and instead narrative takes the front seat in Joyce. So all the things I spoke of, people when they teach fiction, they say fiction is point of view. But Henry James said fiction is only point of view, which was startling. And Joyce said the novel is not story and plot, the novel is narrative, how you narrate it, which is startling. And then Samuel Beckett, Nobel Prize winners, you know, when he wrote The Unnameable, he showed that characterization does not matter, because in Unnameable there is only one character, and that character itself is on a quest for finding out the meaning of what it means to be a self. And since it cannot find it out, it says the self is the unnameable. So Beckett brought in philosophy, his most powerful novel, Unnameable and How It Is, which is a continuation. It's an ontological search for the meaning of words like I, self, being, existence, and language. After this, we come to South America and George Louis Borges. You know, I have done a course from Harvard on masterpieces of world literature, and this book is listed there. There was a prize which was given to Beckett and Borges at the same time. And you know, Borges has two books. One is Labyrinths, and one is Fictions. And in his book, you know, there is this story where there's a character in Fictions. One story is about a character called Pierre Menard. You all know it probably. It's very famous. Where he's writing a book, and the book turns out to be Miguel Cervantes' story of Don Quixote. It's quixotic. How can a writer writing in the 21st century, without having read another book, which was written in the earlier, you know, century, in the 17th century, how can he reproduce that same book? It looks absurd. What is Borges trying to say? And you know, that one is a mock epic, which is a very huge novel. But this is a very short story. This story is very short, about a man writing a novel and finding out that it was already written in the 17th century. What is he talking about? Of course, the first thing he's talking about is what modernists find out. That, you know, there's nothing called originality. That's where I also began. There's nothing called originality. You think what you are doing is original, but it's not original. After some time, we think webinars are original. We think webinars are post-modern. After some time, we'll find out that something like webinars were already done sometime in the past by somebody else. So, you know, this book questions the idea of originality, questions the idea, you know, that fiction. Now, listen to me carefully. What is fiction basically? Fiction is, Coleridge says, you know, we willingly suspend our disbelief. Fiction is a lie that we choose to believe in for some time, something that did not happen. This is what we say. This is what we say. Fiction is, oh, it did not happen. It's a lie. It's something that did not actually happen in history. There are no dragons. But Borges is questioning that very concept, because he says by bringing Don Quixote or Don Quixote into the book, he brings in Miguel de Cervantes, who is the author of this book, and he's asking the question, I am an author, and in my story there's an author, and this author creates a character who already existed, who was created by another author who already existed. So he's asking, not only is he saying there's no originality, we only change things, but he's asking, how can you say fiction is not real? Isn't there a connection between fiction and reality that is deeper than just about the setting, just about the place and the time? Who is real? Are the authors real or are the characters real? Who is more real? Who lives for a longer time? Are there parallel existences where all of them live simultaneously? in which case, isn't the story itself, can we call it fiction, or can we call it a labyrinth, a maze? So he completely, I told you, he completely undid. Again, who is a character? Characterization, point of view, narrative, structure, form, the question of theme. This story, what is the theme here? We really don't know the theme. It's difficult to pinpoint the theme, but the theme seems to be about thinking about the process of creativity. And this or metafictional approach or self-reflexive approach later came to be one of the hallmarks of postmodernism. So there's a wonderful labyrinth here, I want to just read it. We are left asking about the relationship between Menard, the character, and Cervantes, the author, as well as between Menard and Quixote, and Menard and Borges and Cervantes. In short, how does a mock heroic epic develop into a short story? So we find ourselves in a labyrinth. So this writer is very powerful because again, he makes us feel we are in a labyrinth. We are trapped and we can't find the way out. It's a bit stifling. It's like the atmosphere of modern life in a city. And labyrinths are true of city. People always who come to a new city, who come to Delhi, who come to Bangalore, who come to Chennai, who come to Hyderabad and Secunderabad, who come to Kolkata, who come to Mumbai, they get lost. Even with the help of Google Maps and with the help of, Google directions, they get lost. Because we live in labyrinths. And this fiction started reflecting that. Then we have Virginia Woolf, who brings in feminism through her famous essays, Angel in the House and Room with a View, but also through her narrative. She's the first one in a book like The Waves, in a book like To the Lighthouse, in a book especially like Orlando, where the main character is transgender, both male and female. And by using stream of consciousness, she brings in feminism, a landmark, which is a way of telling something from the point of view of a woman, which is different from the way in which a story is told from the point of view of a man. Her way of narration, which she borrowed from stream of consciousness, which she worked on a lot, you can see that it's very different from the way of narration of others who are using stream of consciousness like Joyce or Faulkner. It's very different because you can see that she was really trying for the first time perhaps to tell her story, not his story, but her story. Yeah, and finally we have another writer, Hemingway, An Old Man and the Sea. So I told you about the important writers in fiction: Henry James, James Joyce, Samuel Beckett, George Louis Borges, Virginia Woolf, and finally I am coming to Hemingway. Hemingway is important because when he wrote Old Man and the Sea, you can see immediately that he has shifted from the hero to the ordinary man as hero, the old man. And the second thing is, he has shifted from making human beings as a character to making the sea. The sea is the most powerful character in the book. The sea feeds, the sea takes away life, the sea is a mother, the sea is also a woman, a destroyer, a lover, an antagonist and a protagonist, a helper, a mighty force, but more than that, a character. So characterization changed, point of view analysis changed, narrative structure and form changed. Thematic approach changed. All the 5 points that we teach students in modernism, through a revolution in writing, they were all changed into something else, because modernism can be symbolized not as the time of deconstruction. And now we come to what modernism or modernity is. It is the time of change, of revolutionary change. Everything changed. And it is a shift from tradition and traditional storytelling methods to undoing plot, story, characterization, theme, point of view, and setting towards plurality of methods and multiplicity. Now, these are 2 words I want you to remember. Modernism, when we come to it, is about change, it's about revolution, a radical revolution, radical change, incredible change, happening at the speed of light, very fast. And to essentialize it. Of course, we can't essentialize anything today after postmodernism. But in the time of modernism, we could essentialize things. And when we essentialize it, we are left with a very clear understanding that it is a time of plurality and multiplicity. These are the 2 words I want you to remember. It was a time of pluralism. It was a time of multiple approaches, of open-endedness. And you know, these novels I speak of, for writers, would not have been possible without the first set of points. So it was possible. It was made possible for them because of, you know, Freud, of Marx, and of Darwin. It was made possible for them because of Martin Luther, Freud, Darwin, and Marx and Nietzsche. These are the thinkers who made it possible for these writers to bring about these changes, radical changes in the field of fiction, and to be able to go forward in this particular way. Stream of consciousness is a fallout of psychology. Beckett's masterpiece is a shift to philosophy as a base, Joyce's to literature and local history, Varghese to form and structure as complexity. Modern life is complex, so literature had to be complex. They are all Eurocentric. Woolf is again psychology and politics and feminism. Hemingway's to anti-heroism and the rise of the common man. And an awareness of nature, that we are perhaps dealing in a bad way with nature. The seeds of eco-criticism can be found in Old Man and the Sea. And it is anti-war, against war. Hemingway is against war. It's not macho or machismo as people think. Then, so it was unthinkable before Freudianism and Jung and you know, before Wilhelm Reich, etc. So there is here, for example, the clash of continents in Henry James between America and Europe. It was not possible earlier. And it was not possible without Walter Pater. Walter Pater, Oscar Wilde, and all paved the way for modernism through their, you know, philosophy of art for art's sake. Through the philosophy of art for art's sake. Then, modernism was also opening out. Now the talk becomes interesting for you people. It was opening out literature through the colonies, so that British people started taking cognizance of Irish literature, Scottish literature, Welsh literature, American literature, but not only that. they started taking cognizance of Chinese literature, of Japanese literature, of African literature, and of countries like India, as well as, of course, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, and other parts of Europe like Russia. Japanese art influenced the Impressionists in painting. African art influenced a painter like Picasso. Tahiti left its mark on Gauguin. Pound was introducing Chinese poems to English readers and not just French symbolism. And due to the colonies, people became aware of Vivekananda through the Chicago Address. People became aware of Tagore because of Gitanjali and him winning the Nobel Prize. So this power, for example, can be seen in the Nobel Prize winner, Romain Rolland. Romain Rolland, who won the Nobel Prize, he openly admits that he was influenced by Tagore and Vivekananda. So this is the, this is what Homi Bhabha talks about, hybridity in post-colonialism, the reverse effect of colonialism. Not only did colonialism affect those of us who are in India, but thinkers like Gandhi, Tagore, Vivekananda, and Ambedkar, and Nehru, as well as G.V. Desani, R.K. Narayan, they all made an influence in the West also. They started making their influence in the West. Beat poetry was influenced by Ezra Pound, by Bob Dylan, through Ginsberg, but Ginsberg was influenced by India, and he took India to the West, along with rock music and Ravi Shankar and George Harrison and other people like that. But similarly, India was also influenced through a movement like the Hungry Alice in Kolkata, who were influenced by beat poetry. And even I am influenced by beat poetry. But now I have come to poetry, modernism. Modernism and poetry. Poetry in modernism could not have happened without this multinational, international opening out. And before we speak of poetry, we have to speak of the manifestos, because modern poetry was driven primarily by manifestos and the poets who wrote those manifestos. Very interesting. I have to talk of this briefly. So first, there was a manifesto written by Ezra Pound, who was an American who came and lived in England for some time, and that was a manifesto of imagism, the Imagist Manifesto, and that was taken up by Amy Lowell. Then there was a Vorticist Manifesto, and Vorticism in England was primarily headed by Wyndham Lewis. France had symbolism, but it had the Surrealist Manifesto, and it had Dada. Surrealism was headed by André Breton, and Dada was headed by Tristan Tzara, and the main artist was Marcel Duchamp. You all know all these things. Italy had Futurism with Marinetti. It also had Unanimism with Unamuno. Russia had Atomism with Mandelstam and Anna Akhmetova, which was against communism. But at the same time, there was Mayakovsky and there was Constructivism, which was pro-Marxism and communism. And they were all writing manifestos. And these manifestos were more interesting and important than the poems that these people were creating. More people were reading the manifestos than the poems themselves. Dadaism, Surrealism, they became catchwords and phrases all over the world. So though it is tough for us to acknowledge these manifestos, we also have to realize that many of them leaned to violent communism, to fascism politically. Pound became a fascist, and they saw nothing very wrong with these movements. And if not politically inclined, they glorified violence, machismo, sometimes anti-Semitism, misogyny, racism. So Pound and Eliot were later accused of all these things, and rightly so. You can see traces. They even, You know, to some extent, many of them justify empire, they justify colonies, they justify colonialism, they justify imperialism, the idea of empire, and you know, they believe that they are doing a plus point to us, but it's not true. As I said, and because it has two sides, the minus and the plus point, and the minus point was probably much more. As I said, the thrust was to revolutionary change and multiplicity and plurality. Unless we see this whole picture of the extent of the influence of modernism over countries and continental spaces and times, because modernism covers a period of 100 years, 1853 till the end of the First World War and the end of the Second World War. So modernism actually stretches from 1850 to 1950, you can say, about 100 years. Yeah, and you know, so it covers periods of time, spaces, countries, and even continents, coupled with changes in science and technology, which was the driving force, and by networks of distribution that could carry books across ocean and through air to get it to places it had never been before. These changes in science and technology were affecting all of us, leading to a breakdown in the preeminence of the written word and spoken word, which was being replaced by the image. And this is a natural fallout. You want to see me, you want to hear me, rather than wanting to read me. So this is like the very end of modernism in a way. And you want to see a PowerPoint, but I don't use PowerPoints because PowerPoints are reductive. It's too simplistic. And instead you can listen to the talk over and over again. And I will send you the MS Word document. I will send it to the organizers and they can send it if they want, along with the link to everyone who wants to read it, which will be a much better way of grappling with what I have said. So let us come to the poets who matter. Found with his Pisan cantos and Imageson's rules and definitions of literature and poetry, as well as his interest in French symbolism that influenced W.B. Yeats too, and Chinese poetry and calligraphy brought a huge change. He also brought in unwelcome things, but to give the devil his due, he stretches not only down to people, his influence, like Hugh MacDiarmid, David Jones, Hart Crane, William Carlos Williams, Louis Zukowski, the Black Mountain Poets, Jeffrey Hill writing today, to someone like me, and through Ginsberg even to the Beach Poets. Even as Ginsberg also carried Bob Dylan to Pound to make him listen to Bob Dylan, and he carried India to the West and vice versa. Hungry Realism in India was an outcome of all this. Another movement. So when we speak of modernist poetry, we have to speak of individuals, manifestos, schools of writing, movements across Europe and Asia and North and South America. Wallace Stevens was different and cannot be found in this stream, but he can be called a modernist. T.S. Eliot, after Pound, is the second important figure. And if the Pisan cantos had not been written, the Wasteland, along with Ulysses, would have been enough to ensure a definitive text for modernism in poetry. And Pound and Eliot would be remembered as editor and writer, even as Ulysses by James Joyce is the defining novel of the modernist movement. The most astute comment I ever heard on The Wasteland came from Beckett, who said that it showed the breakdown between the subject and object, implying between the self and the world and the mind and the body too, a breakdown of, in other words, of the Cartesian view of the world. An interpretation that was more about Beckett than about Wasteland. Eliot also matters for his terms like unified sensibility, dissociation of sensibility, objective correlative, his interest in metaphysical poetry and the metaphysical conceit, his reading of Hamlet, his reading of culture, his book Sacred Wood, the idea of the sacred and the profane, and so many other things. Now, I want to talk about this. Modernism is a breakdown of the Enlightenment. It's the end of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was Cartesian. Cartesianism was the ruling principle. Cartesianism divided the world into subject and object, mind and body, and self and world. So when Beckett says the wasteland is a breakdown between the self and the world, showing that there's a gap between the self and the world. There's a lack of communication. The self is unable to communicate with the world. The world does not communicate to the self. He marks a beginning. This is very modern. There's a breakdown between the mind and the body. This is very modern. There's a breakdown between the subject and the object. These breakdowns are clearly shown best in a poem like The Wasteland. We struggle to make sense of it. It is allusive, referential, intertextual, multilingual, but that's not why we struggle to make sense of it. We struggle to make sense of it because there is a breakdown in communication between the mind and body of T.S. Eliot while writing the poem. There's a breakdown in communication between T.S. Eliot and the reader. There's a breakdown in communication between the world and T.S. Eliot self. And this breakdown of communication is purposefully brought in and represented by T.S. Eliot to show the situation of modernism. That is not only a time of growth, but it's a time of decay and disintegration of some old values. And so it becomes a typical text. There's even a breakdown of communication between T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, who edited it. The parts that Eliot thought important, Ezra Pound took out. The parts that Eliot thought not important, Ezra Pound said keep it. So even there was a difference of opinion. But still, it is not like postmodernism. It is about multiplicity and pluralism. The third important point is Yeats. Yeats is, started as a romantic poet, but he was converted by Eliot and Pound and Ford Madox Ford. After that, he started writing modernist poetry influenced by French symbolism. But one thing that's very important about him is he started practicing automatic writing. A medium would write messages from another world, and Yeats would take what the medium wrote and make points of them. So he not only had a system of symbolism, but he started using automatic writing, and he had a vision for Irish literature. So this is a breakdown of the monolithic approach to English literature. That is only British literature. Now English literature became Indians writing in English, it became Irish literature, it became American literature, Scottish literature, Welsh literature. It became, Gaelic, the influence of Gaelic and different kinds of Christianity and Englishes and a revival in Gaelicism. All this was brought on because of Yeats, and Yeats and Eliot got the Nobel Prize. Tolstoy and Joyce did not get it. Tagore got it. Vivekananda did not get it for peace. But they are all, people who are all names connected, or we are connecting. I am connecting now. I am reconnecting all the dots. I am bringing in all the nations. I am bringing in all the languages. And I am going all over the continents and spaces and time to reconnect modernism as international, as intercontinental, as interlinguistic, as intertextual, as interreferential. And I'm showing you about the fiction and the poetry. It's a very vast overview, a bird's eye view, and you need this kind of overview if you really want to talk about modernism the way someone like Anthony Giddens when he goes into analysis. But first you need this basis, this foundation. Otherwise you can't go forward. So, Joyce, Beckett and Yeats, they made Ireland very famous. But I'll come more about that. Modernism in poetry is thus I'm limiting it and stopping it. I told you 6 novelists, but I'm only telling you 3 poets because I'm running out of time and I have to limit myself. So, the poets I spoke about are Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, and W.B. Yeats, and 2 are Nobel Prize winners. Modernism in poetry is of these 3 greats, very much under the shadow of Matthew Arnold, talking of literature replacing the Bible and culture saving us from anarchy and Philistinism with its refinement and civilization, and the answer being education. Thomas Arnold. Thomas Arnold and Matthew Arnold are in the background of these writers to the problems of mankind, etc. And so it is called high modernism. Low modernism takes its antecedents in the more traditional realistic poetry of writers like Thomas Hardy and Victor Hugo of France. So just as there was high modernism, at the same time, Thomas Hardy and Victor Hugo were writing realistic poetry, very different from the kind of poetry that Pound and Eliot and Yeats in his modernist phase was writing. But later, when we look back, we find that their poetry, Hardy's poetry, also mattered. So that realistic poetry, and now we don't say Ulysses matters, Finnegan's Wake matters, but portrait of the artist as a young man and Dubliners and Zola, Emile Zola's Germinal, and Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, they also matter, though they are realistic, though they are impressionistic. It's not everything matters finally. It's not that only some things matter. So that's poetry. Now to come to drama, we need to talk of the very exciting plays of Eugene Ionesco first. Eugene Ionesco's play, and then the elaborately staged ones of Jean Genet, the minimalism linked to the existentialism and nihilism of Samuel Beckett, and the dark presence of the Pinterest world's Pinterest, Harold Pinter, a world of unsolvable mysteries. We also need to speak of Lorca. Lorca was writing in Spain. And we have to speak of Luigi Pirandello, who was writing a novel. 6 authors, 6 characters in search of an author. So, we can't really separate fiction or poetry and drama when we come to the world of drama. It's a mixture of all this. But when we speak of the Romanian dramatist Eugene Ionesco, and we speak of the rhinoceros, which is, his most interesting play for me, although Chairs is as startling, and so is the bald prima donna. They're all startling plays. But rhinoceros is where a character turns into a rhinoceros. How do you show this on stage? Everyone has changed into a rhinoceros, and the character changes into a rhinoceros. How do you show this on stage? How do you show? Kafka wrote a book called Metamorphosis. Kafka is another very important figure in modernism because of Metamorphosis, Trial, Castle, and America. But how do you show on stage a character slowly turning into a rhinoceros? Not in 1 minute. If it's in 1 minute, he can go behind the stage where a rhinoceros dress or mask can come back. But we make out, so something which was never thought of before, a metaphor for modern life. We are all becoming thick-skinned. We are all dangerous. At the same time, we are becoming animalistic. At the same time, we are helpless like rhinoceros are, or rhinoceri are. A very powerful image, as in the image of Chairs by Ionesco, where there is a stage and empty chairs. There's no audience, and the characters are selling popcorn, and they are also acting, and they are speaking before the play, waiting for people, and the play never happens. There are just the chairs, and the chairs are watching. Inanimate objects and the audience become characters in the play. the breaking down of the fourth wall, playing across the footlights, going into the audience, all these things which have never been thought of before. Drama as performance and space, and not as stage and proscenium and curtain, to speak of it in terms of dramaturgy. What about Beckett? What about Waiting for Godot? Dialogue and silences. When silence becomes dialogue, when pauses are more meaningful than speech, when characters don't move, when there is minimum scenery, only a tree, only a few leaves in the second act, when time seems to stand still as opposed to time that moves. A very queer play where he keeps the unities, but at the same time, he keeps it in such an odd manner. I'm talking about Waiting for Godot. You all understood that. He keeps it in such an odd manner that he also breaks all the unities. Where Vladimir exits and Godot says, if you are going to the bathroom, it's, at the end of the stage, third exit to the right. The awareness that drama is drama, the same as in Varghese. And then the third powerful French dramatist, Jean Genet. Jean Genet, balcony, the blacks. The blacks already symbolizes Frantz Fanon's, white skin black mask. It's already there in blacks. He uses masks. He uses charades. He uses mirrors. Yeah, and the balcony, about the corruption of the rich people and the church and the capitalistic society in which he lives. How they are having an orgy while outside the people are suffering, and speaking for homosexual people. So very powerful place, and what was started by Shaw or Chekhov or Strindberg or Oscar Wilde, these people take it to the level of modernism. So we can't, in their place we find fiction, we find prose, we find poetry, we find realism, we find surrealism, and meaningless as a theme, a sorrow at no longer being able to understand the world or fit in, that a world that breeds tragedy on a colossal scale in the lives of individuals through events like the First World War, the need for change in dramatic conventions, revolution in the theatre, being more theatrical by being less so, by being obviously theatrical, all traits of modernism. The place I told you about, rhinoceros chairs, Waiting for Godot, Endgame, Happy Days, All That Fall, Crab's Last Tape, The Black Balcony, Bald Prima Donna, Six Characters in Search of an Author by Luigi Pirandello, Lorca's Blood Wedding, Yerma, all speak well for the space of modernist drama. Well studied by Martin Esslin. Esslin leaves out Lorca. In his book, Theatre of the Absurd, which is also excellent in pointing out two other thinkers. It points out modernism's depth to Albert Camus' essay on suicide and brings in the word absurd, absurd. Brings in Sisyphus' punishment and the idea of suicide and dismisses it for existentialism, even as in earlier times people look to Icarus as a figure. But here, Beckett and Camus and all look to Sisyphus as a figure, look to Daedalus and not Icarus. Joyce looks to Daedalus, father of Icarus. And Sartre was writing, meanwhile, his masterpieces about being, which is a constant topic from Heidegger and, for Habermas, and also for Hegel. And we can't talk of any of these thinkers without talking of Hegel's theory of aesthetics. Now we come to non-fiction. Ernesto Boyle with the theater of the oppressed, which comes also from the pedagogy of, education, in South America. Ernesto Boyle also is made possible because of modernism. So some of you may want to look up Theater of the Oppressed by Ernesto Boyle, which is a later development, which is postmodern. To come or a movement like Fluxus with Yoko Ono and all that, that's postmodern. But that comes later. So now we come to non-fiction. That matter. Listen to me carefully. I'm sorry, I'm switching on the teacher mode. You know and listen to me carefully and all. But these books are important. You all know it. Charles Darwin, The Origin of Species. Karl Marx, Das Kapital, which is by Marx and Engels. Then Here I Stand by Martin Luther. Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. John Ruskin, Sesame and Lilies. And then Walter Pater, especially that section on Mona Lisa in his book, where he talks about Mona Lisa and he says what matters about her is the aesthetic quality of the painting and not any reference to politics or economics or anything. It dismisses all that. Then Ferdinand de Saussure's course in general linguistics for bringing in the terms sign, signifier, signified and reference, without which there is no modern theory. Without which there is no formalism, Russian formalism, structuralism, post-structuralism, deconstruction, and no postmodernism finally. Then Roland Barthes' mythologies, because he makes it, he takes the sign introduced by Saussure, and Saussure is more important than Chomsky here. But he creates a model, a semiotic model of analysis, mythologies with lexis and semia, which came to be used by formalists and structuralists and post-structuralists especially. And then Jacques Derrida's grammatology for deconstruction. I mentioned this book because without it and without its theory that there's no signifier without another signifier, the study of differences, which is very key, postmodernism. Where he says we are trapped in the text, there is only the text. We can only go from one signifier to another, and we recognize one signifier from another signifier only because it sounds different and it looks different, and there's no connection between the sound and the signifier or the look and the signifier. In fact, it's very disturbing to understand Derrida, because if we understand Derrida, we lose our grip on meaning. I consider Derrida more disturbing than Nietzsche, but Nietzsche and Derrida are people we cannot skip any more than we can skip Marx, or any more than we can skip Freud, or any more than we can skip Lacan. And when I come to Lacan in post-structuralism and in psychoanalytic analysis, just like Freud's reading of Oedipus Rex is very important, Lacan's reading of the Purloined Letter by Edgar Allan Poe is very important, and you have to read it. Similarly, there's an essay by Umberto Eco on the naive and the sophisticated reader, and that's also very important. So, since we studied modernism in a roundabout way, let me bring on postmodernism. I enter the second part of my talk. Let me bring on postmodernism in the same way. Postmodernism, if modernism predates the Second World War with no clear beginning, because I put fiction's beginning in the 18th century, I took you back to Cervantes, which is in the 17th century, I took you back to Shakespeare in the 16th century through Hamlet, and I brought you to 1850s, then 1900, the turn of the century, then First World War, Second World War. I named so many countries and spaces and times. Similarly, postmodernism doesn't begin. Postmodernism doesn't begin with postmodernism. It already began in the time of modernism. Self-reflexivity began in the time of postmodernism, began in the time of modernism. And Linda Hutchinson already wrote a book on metafiction during the time of modernism. And Italo Calvino, who wrote If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, which is a classic of the beginning of postmodernism, where do you place him? If you read Baron of the Trees, that is very modernist. But if you read If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, it is the beginning of postmodernism in fiction. So it is clear that postmodernism is part of the aftermath of the Second World War. So if you want a date, it can start in 1939 or, in 1940 or in the 40s or 50s. I mean, I leave it to you because it's very indistinct. Some people even say it began only in the 60s. I have read a study where rock music, not rock music exactly, but electronic music. There's a group called Buggles, and Buggles has a song called Video Killed the Radio Star. And one critic says that's the beginning of postmodernism because radio is dead. Radio was a modernist phenomenon. And I told you, modernism replaced the word with the image through radio, which speaks to the ear, through film, through photography, through cinema, and through stills, which all brought in, frottage, assemblage, collage, pastiche, and in film especially, Sergei Eisenstein's, technique of montage. That is all modernism. But here we come to postmodernism, and some people say it began in 39, the 40s and 50s, and I just told you now that maybe it began in the 60s, and maybe it began in the 70s, maybe in the 80s, maybe in the 90s. Why not? It can begin anywhere. It needn't begin only in the past with Hamlet, with the play within the play, or with the question of death and its meaning or meaninglessness. It can begin in the future also. And that's the important point I am coming to. It can begin in the immediate past. And so when we come to postmodernism, for me it begins as a part of the aftermath of the Second World War, with its disastrous consequences on human beings, especially in Europe. Perhaps one of its harbingers was Nietzsche, with his books, especially also Sprach Zarathustra, that said God is dead. God is dead. Allah is dead. Shiva is dead. Vishnu is dead. Any title you give to God, Kali is dead. I know that now I have become controversial, but when he said God is dead, that is what he meant. He meant that the idea of God is dead. And if God is dead, of course, he was specifically attacking Christianity because he was in Europe and Christianity was the main form of religion he wanted to attack. But it applies, if you read, his Antichrist and the Twilight of the Idols, it applies to all religions. Finally, Jehovah is dead. Then what is left behind is a void. And modernism was trying to fill that void. The God-shaped void left behind by the so-called death of God, which was, declared by Nietzsche in also Sprach Zarathustra, it was something that modernists were trying to fill in with literature, with art, with science, with technology, especially with science and technology, and with new forms of politics like democracy, communism, Marxism, fascism. They were trying to fill the end of the period of grand narratives. The grand narratives were, the Bible, Homer, Kalivala, the Norwegian Nibelungen Light, Beowulf, and King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. You can say that all these Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid, Paradise Lost, Dante's book, all these were grand narratives. And around the world, Mahabharata and Ramayana, all these are grand narratives. The Quran, grand narrative. What do you mean by grand narrative? Grand narrative is something that a huge number, millions, the Dhammapada, Buddhism, millions and trillions and crores of people are able to consider that this is a system where all our questions that we ask, we will find the answers for. And what science and technology brought in was, and what Nietzsche, thinkers like Freud, Nietzsche, Marx, who are sometimes called destructive thinkers, I don't call them that. I don't call them destructive thinkers. If we speak of Saussure, Freud, Nietzsche, Marx, and Martin Luther, and you speak of Lacan, you speak of and Charles Darwin. They are called destructive thinkers by some people, but they are only agents, according to me, agents of change. Change happens in human life, and they set off change. They triggered off change. So when after this God-shaped void came into existence, many people suggested many answers to fill it. In the 60s, for example, there are the flower children of USA. They mixed Indian mysticism, rock and roll, sex, drugs, peace and happiness, violence, or free love. They were both strands, and they were hippies, and they brought in a new philosophy. So there was no center anymore. The center could be anywhere in the world. And the center was everywhere in the world. And out of the fear of what modernism was doing, cultural studies started in a way, but that was also a counter reaction to colonialism and imperialism, correctly. And post-colonialism started, but that was also again a reaction to colonialism and imperialism, which was a child of modernity. But in literature, postmodernism, in theory, we have to come to this book. And I will end here. I don't know how much time I have, whether I have 1 hour or 1.5 hours. I don't plan to end quickly, but if I have to stop, the authorities can send me a message on chat, and I will stop. I'll wind up quickly, but first I want to give the definition of postmodernism. Where do you go if you want the definition of postmodernism? You have to read the book. All the books I'm talking about. I want to tell you this, okay? This is the difference between the second rung of literature and the first rung. The books I'm talking of are all books I have actually read. This is very important for any researcher to zero in on exactly what matters. You have to read a book, read it many times to grasp the crux of it, so you can simplify it for the audience. So postmodernism, which is a book that we have to read. The book you have to read is The Postmodern Condition by Jean-Francois Lyotard. If you don't read this book, you have no idea about postmodernism, because this is a book that gives a very excellent definition, which I am going to talk about now. And Lyotard could not have written this book without Marxism, without his knowledge of science and technology, without his knowledge of digital literacies, without his knowledge of computerized societies, and his knowledge of knowledge himself. So knowledge of capitalism, knowledge of politics and economics, and of grand narratives of religion and mysticism and spirituality. The first point I want to make is people think that Lyotard is criticizing religion and spirituality and mysticism. He is not. He says these grand narratives will continue to exist. He says, I am not attacking them, I am saying they will continue to exist. But what he is saying is, the new grand narrative that is coming is something that will destroy even the idea of the nation state and is instead based on trade and commerce, but not only of money, but also of capital and knowledge and networks of distribution, which all has gained value. And what he says is the new grand narrative is going to be set by science and technology. And his worry with that is, whereas he uses a very interesting word, which is not often used in talks by people, and that is and that is conviviality. Conviviality. That means he says science and technology does not have a human face, to put it very simply. And he says if the old grand narratives are not enough, and the new grand narrative of science and technology has a problem, he comes to this point of defining, he says many interesting things. Nation states will only one day fight for control of information, which is happening now. He talks about the rise of China. And he says, finally he defines it. He defines it and he says, what postmodernism is postmodernism will imagine the unrepresentable. It will conceive the unrepresentable, which is not what is done by any of these systems. None of them have been able to conceive the unrepresentable. So the job of the postmodernist artist is to conceive it. And so he will know the tools of his art only after he realizes it and looks back on it. So it is always in progress, and it is creating the future, and it is set in a point in the future from it only which it can be understood. So to sum it up in one sentence, the job of postmodernism or the postmodernist artist is to conceive the unrepresentable and to present it. Now to come to the immediate present, we see this happening. And who are the thinkers you need to think about? You need to read Hegel, you need to read Roland Barthes, you need to read Jacques Derrida, you need to read Lacan. And the typical example he quotes is Finnegan's Wake. He says Finnegan's Wake is a postmodernist work par excellence, unlike Marcel Proust, because here for the first time someone is trying to conceive the unrepresentable, by creating a new language. And this was done by Tolkien also, when he created new languages. And you need to read Baudrillard for his views on hyperrealism. America, he says, is not real, but is hyperreal. It is a construct. America is actually a construct. It is neo-realist. It's not real. It's not a real place. If you read his book on America, it's exciting. Hyperrealism. You also need to read Neuromancer by William Gibson, because that talks of Siberia. Dr. Rat by a novel, which deals on research on animals. You need to read Benjamin Bratton, because he speaks of digital literacies. He speaks of artificial intelligence, of splicing, cloning, of smart cities, which are, of artificial biopolitics and biocreations. We are going to create new places which are totally artificial. What's the politics behind that? You need to read Agamben, Zizek, Butler. You need to read also Alain Badiou. And then you need to know about the future of money. You need to know about the future of smart cities. Yeah, this is, to give up, I have run out of time, and Kavya tells me that I have to give for time for questions and answers. So I am winding up here, but please remember, you can't start on postmodernism without reading all the people I have mentioned. Thank you very much. Now I will take questions, which please relay the questions to me. The organizers have to relay the questions to me. Thank you.
Sure, sir. Thank you, sir. That was a very detailed and a wonderful session. I'll now post the select questions from audience. Mr. Syed Shah, YouTube participant, asks that while meta-narratives exemplify postmodernism, don't they eventually become a form of grand narrative?
Yeah, this is a very good question. Can you tell me who is asking this?
Syed Shah.
Syed Shah, thank you for asking this question. This is, of course, one of the very important questions, because you have actually answered your question in your own way. We had narratives. If you take Mahabharata, Ramayana, Bible, Quran, you take Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, you take Kalevala, you take Nibelung and Late, we had narratives. And as you said, what happens in modernism through formalism, structuralism, post-structuralism, and through deconstructionists, we started studying those narratives as to how they are put together. And so that became a study in meta-narrative. That's why we have thinkers like Svetan Todorov or Gerard Genette, who specialize in narratology. And definitely meta-narrative is an attempt to become a grand narrative, because finally we are seeking the similarities and differences and commonalities between all these narratives. But when we come to postmodernism, Lyotard says don't be complacent and think that any narrative can become a grand narrative, because every grand narrative, even meta-narrative, will have its flaws. That's why he says Hegel posits a transcendental illusion, and only that transcendental illusion, which does not exist, can be a grand narrative which answers all our questions, all the questions of every human being. This is why Hegel is so important, because he posits this transcendental illusion. And Lyotard says, don't allow people like Giddens to hijack the project of postmodernism, because they say postmodernism is bad, it's against humanism. But he says no, postmodernism is a warning not to relapse into complacency, otherwise the First and Second World War will happen again. There will be a Third World War, there will be a Fourth World War. So we have to live on the cusp of nothingness, to use a word from Nietzsche. I hope I answered your question satisfactorily.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Priyanka Nayak. She requests you to share a few fiction that you think are more close representatives of modernism and postmodernism, respectively, sir.
I already gave this, actually. If you talk about modernism, if you talk about modernism and the influence of impressionism on it, by impressionism I mean primarily the work of someone like Emile Zola through a book like Nana. You have to speak of Zola's Germinal, I mentioned that. But if you speak of realism, first you have to speak of Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary in French fiction. Then you have to speak of Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, a la Recherche du Temps perdu. which is a series of novels. Again, I mentioned that when I'm speaking of Lyotard. Then the third book you have to speak of is Ulysses by James Joyce, which of course is the classic text for those who are speaking of modernism in terms of fiction. But let us not stop there, since you want more books. Virginia Woolf, I mentioned, To the Lighthouse, The Waves, but much more Orlando, because of the transgender character in it. When we go to America, I mentioned, Gertrude Stein with her book Tender Buttons, very significant if you are into feminism. William Faulkner, Sound and Fury. Ernest Hemingway, For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Sun Also Rises, and of course, Old Man and the Sea. John Dos Passos, write down this name, John Dos Passos. I mean, I can go on like this, there are so many writers and so many books, so I don't know. Italo Calvino, I told you, you have to read him. He's absolutely, if you come to Russia, Mikhail, the writer who wrote, The Princess and Margarita. His first name is Mikhail, second name is slipping my mind. I've read that novel. Okay, so, but that's another very key novel if you want to know about modernism in Russia. Just type Mikhail Margarita and you will get it, novel, so the second name. Yeah, I mean, if you want more, I can go on with names, but I know, when do I stop?
Okay, sir. Last question for the session is from Sudeep Sinha. He's asking about the position of subject in modern and postmodern context.
Yeah, this is again a very, the second question was only about, facts, and the third question is very interesting. Okay. I want questions like this. I hope that you allow me to speak till 10:30 answering questions. So you see, this is very important. I told you that modernism is actually a reaction against, and also, the last gasp of the Enlightenment project by, white people to show that, or Eurocentric people to show that they were superior instead of taking a position of equality. I mean, that's the way I look at Enlightenment now. It may be controversial to others anyway, but, so one of their key thinkers, because Enlightenment is supposed to be, the time of rationalism, no place for irrationality. Do you believe in the Bible? Oh, you must be foolish. Do you believe in the Quran? You must be foolish. Do you believe in Mahabharata and Ramayana? You must be foolish. They didn't understand the significance of grand narrative or myth. So their key thinker was, who broke down the grand narratives of religion in the West, was Descartes. Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am. This is his most famous statement. But he had a book, Discourse on Method. This was a classic book. You have to read that book if you want to know. And in that book, he divided, he said, I'm going to sit in a room, I throw out all knowledge, and I'm going to start afresh. He was a very daring thinker, and he found he said, I find there is existence only for three dualities. The first duality is subject and object. I am the subject, and all around me there are objects. And he said, I am the self, and all around me there is the world. And he said, who am I? I am a mind and I am a body. This is very radical. This is a rupture with all thinkers before him. But it was a radical that threw out the baby with the bath water. Because earlier people said, when speaking of human beings, they said, I am not a subject, I am also an object. And I'm not only the self, but I'm also part of the world. And I'm not only mind and body, I'm also mind, heart, will, soul, spirit, body, blood, life, etc. So he had reduced it. He said, I think, therefore I am. So I am just a mind. But then he thought, but the mind can't exist uh, in the air. So the mind needs a body. So he said, I am also a body. I am a mind situated in a body. So in all modernism, you can see they are replaying Descartes. They show the breakdown of the older systems. They are replaying Descartes, but they can't replay to the extent where there is no subject. Because if there is no subject, who can record the breakdown of everything? To break down the record of everything, there still has to be a recorder. And the recorder is the subject, the recorder is the I. So Beckett quoted Bishop Berkeley, and he said, I exist because I am perceived. Someone has to perceive me. Otherwise, I don't exist. And who perceives this I? So Bishop Berkeley said, I exist because God perceives me. In Indian philosophy, we say, I exist because I perceive myself. But the second I is God. The second I is God in Indian philosophy. That is Aham Brahm Asmi. Understand? But in modernism, there is no second I. There is no second I. There is only an I who is the subject who records. Understand? There is no I perceiving the I who records. Varghese raises the question, Beckett raises the question, but they don't answer it. They want to leave it open-ended. That's why they are modern. Now in postmodernism, we move into subjectivities. We move into subject positions within the self and without the self. We speak of intra-subjectivities and inter-subjectivities. There is a play of subjectivities. That is why we can speak in postmodernism of LGBTQIA. Earlier, during the time of traditionalism, there were only two genders, masculine and feminine, two subject positions, male and female, man and woman. But now we can speak of lesbian, bisexual, gay, transsexual or transgender, LGBTQ or queer positions, okay, because there are many other positions inside these positions. Then intersexuality, then asexuality, right? So you see, now in the time of postmodernism, we don't have just one subject, one unitary subject, nor do we have just a duality, but we have splintered subjectivities, and we don't know how to integrate these subjectivities. That is why there's a pride movement, because the pride movement is a movement saying we also want to belong to society. Don't say we don't belong. We also belong. Where are we being? Why don't you integrate us? Why do you say, there's only you and us? Why don't you say we, where we are also part of you and you are also part of us? So postmodernism raises questions, and it's also trying to find the answer to this question. But meta-narrative won't be a grand narrative, no, because the nature of postmodernism is to question grand narratives. And I hope I have answered your question of subject in modernism and subject in postmodernism satisfactorily. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That will be it for Q&A. Sir, I thank you on behalf of the organizing committee and truly appreciate the dedicated efforts of academicians like you who go the extra mile through generosity and kindness to enrich the teaching fraternity, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Can I say one thing?
Yes, sir. Sure.
Can I just say one thing? Yeah, I want to thank all of you for giving me this opportunity, and thank you for the audience. Thank you for some fantastic questions. And I'll be sending I'll be sending the MS Word document of this to Kavya and to Kavya. And if you want, you can release it to all the participants because I haven't got PowerPoint. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Sure, sir. We'll share it with the participants once we receive it, sir. Thank you very much, sir. So you may leave the room now. We'll get in touch with you very shortly. And now for the participants, the link of attendance cum feedback has been shared in the chat box. Your participation will be validated only if you fill this form, and this link will be active for next 20 minutes. Please do fill it before the time lapses. And the link has also been posted in our YouTube live chat. So please do fill it before the time lapses.